July 24th, 1944. The sun hung high over the French countryside, its searing heat a reminder that summer was in full force. The sounds of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of radio transmissions, seemed almost muted in the oppressive stillness of the moment. The land around the town of Sainte Marie was scarred by the heavy footsteps of war, yet for a brief instant, the battlefield fell silent, as though even the earth itself was holding its breath. It was the height of the Allied push through Normandy. The D-Day landings had opened a gateway to Western Europe, and for the men of the 7th Armored Division, this was the moment to advance. The Americans, eager and relentless, had managed to break through the initial defenses. But they were now face to face with the brutal reality of the German war machine, entrenched, calculated, and resolute. Among them was Sergeant William Bill Carter, a 26-year-old gunner with the 7th Armored Division's artillery unit. A seasoned soldier, Bill had already been in combat for more than 2 years, but this was unlike anything he had experienced before. The landscape, once green and peaceful, now lay in ruin. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, oil, and fear. The Germans were well dug in, their artillery positions strategically placed in the hills surrounding the village of Sainte Marie. Intelligence reports had confirmed their presence, but the exact location of their stronghold was still uncertain. The time had come to neutralize them. Bill crouched down next to the massive M7 Priest, a self-propelled 105mm Howitzer. Its turret, once sleek and polished, now bore the marks of combat, scratches, dents, and the unmistakable stains of battle. Bill's fingers traced the cold metal, a reminder of the power at his disposal. The howitzer was one of the best pieces of artillery the Americans had, fast, versatile, and deadly. It had been a staple of their offensive strategy since the early days of the Normandy invasion. Bill had become one with the machine over the past year. The hum of the engine, the recoil from each fired round, the rhythmic shuffling of the crew as they moved in sync, it was all second nature. But today was different. Today they were targeting a German stronghold, and the stakes had never been higher. The radio crackled to life, and Bill could hear the voice of his commanding officer, Major Thompson. "Sergeant Carter, we have a target at coordinates 320156. German positions are heavily fortified. We need you to clear the path for the infantry. Fire when ready." Bill's breath caught in his throat. He had been in similar situations before, but something about this mission felt different. The pressure was mounting. The Germans had been relentless, and the infantry was depending on the artillery to break the stalemate. Failure was not an option. He turned to his crew, each man focused, silent, as they prepared the M7 Priest for action. Corporal Jacobs, the loader, gave a sharp nod, signaling that the gun was ready. Bill took his position, his hands steady as he gripped the controls. He could hear the soft whirring of the turret as it adjusted its aim, locking onto the coordinates. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The moment of silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of the radio. "Firing order confirmed," Major Thompson's voice crackled again. "Clear the way." Bill's heart raced. He knew what came next. He could almost feel the force of the shell as it made its way through the barrel, the shock wave vibrating through the ground beneath him. This was it, the shot that would change everything. With a deep breath, Bill pulled the trigger. The M7 Priest roared to life, the blast of the 100mm Howitzer splitting the air with a deafening crack. Bill watched, his eyes narrowed, as the shell soared through the air, a silver streak in the fading light. But the seconds that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. The sound of the shot still echoed in his ears, and yet there was no immediate response. The Germans, hidden in their fortified positions, had only moments to react. Would the shell hit its mark? Would it clear the way for the infantry, or would it fall short, leaving them exposed? The tension was unbearable. Bill's fingers tightened around the controls and his mind raced. The fear of missing, of failing his comrades, gnawed at him. The infantry needed this breakthrough, but the Germans were skilled, relentless. They knew how to fight back, how to survive. The waiting was the worst part, and in that moment, Bill realized something. It wasn't the sound of the gunfire that haunted him. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that everything hinged on those precious seconds. And in those seconds, as the ground trembled beneath him, Bill understood what it meant to be at the edge of war. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Bill Carter sat motionless, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold metal of the M7 Priest control handles. The blast from the 105mm Howitzer had torn through the quiet of the French countryside, but the immediate result was uncertain. The silence after the shot seemed endless, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Bill had always prided himself on his focus in combat, but now as the echoes of the shot still reverberated in his chest, doubt gnawed at him. The terrain ahead was treacherous, and the German positions, well concealed and heavily fortified, were far from easy targets. Could they have missed? Could the shell have veered off course? The thought lingered in the back of his mind, refusing to go away. Beside him, Corporal Jacobs, the loader, checked the chamber for the next round. His movements were quick and practiced, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen too many battles, too many lost comrades, betrayed the tension building in his chest. Bill glanced at Jacobs. The younger man's face was set, lips tight, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled ever so slightly as he worked. It wasn't the fear of the shot that bothered Jacobs. It was the unknown, the waiting. Everyone in the crew felt it, but no one spoke it aloud. Bill took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The war had made him resilient. He had learned to shut out the fear, to compartmentalize the stress, to focus on the task at hand. But this mission felt different. The sound of the shot, the brief flash of light as the shell left the barrel, were only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The radio crackled to life once again, breaking the silence. Sergeant Carter, we're receiving reports of enemy movement in the area. Be prepared for a counterattack. The Germans are likely to respond quickly. It was Major Thompson's voice, as calm and commanding as always, but there was a sharp edge to his tone. Bill knew what that meant. The Germans were preparing to retaliate. The time to act was now. The infantry would be depending on them, but the Germans had already begun their countermeasures. Bill's heart skipped a beat. The tension, the stakes, were rising by the second. He glanced over at Sergeant McAllister, the driver, sitting in the cockpit of the M7 Priest, his face lit by the dimming sunlight. McAllister had been with Bill since the early days of the invasion. He was a quiet man, not given to much conversation, but his loyalty was unwavering. McAllister turned to Bill, his face set in a grim expression. We're not out of the woods yet, Bill. If the next shot misses, they'll have us in their sights. Bill nodded silently. McAllister was right. They had to make sure the next shot counted. If they failed, it would be their last shot. The German artillery was just as accurate, if not more so, and they had seen firsthand how quickly a well-placed counterattack could turn the tide of battle. The seconds continued to drag on. Bill wiped his brow, trying to focus, but the oppressive weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. This was more than just artillery. It was about survival, about doing whatever it took to ensure that the men under his command, his brothers, would make it through another day. They had seen the faces of the infantry who would be fighting alongside them, and Bill knew how much was riding on their success. The German response came suddenly without warning. A series of shells exploded in the distance, sending shock waves through the air. The ground trembled beneath them as if the earth itself was trying to break free from the chaos unfolding above. The sound of the artillery barrage was deafening, and for a brief moment, Bill thought he might be caught in the blast. The sound of the shells exploding was like thunder, shaking his chest and rattling his bones. "Incoming!" Jacob shouted, diving for cover. Bill didn't wait. He dove to the side, his body hitting the hard earth with a thud. The explosion that followed was deafening, and for a split second, everything went black. When Bill regained his senses, his ears were ringing, and the dust and smoke of the battlefield surrounded him. His head swam as he tried to push himself up, but his body felt heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Jacobs was already on his feet, frantically checking the M7 Priest for damage. "We've been hit," Jacobs shouted. "It's the engine, Bill. We're not going anywhere unless we fix it." Bill could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he forced it down. They couldn't afford to panic. They had to move quickly, or they would be sitting ducks. "Get the wrench," he shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. "McAllister, get back in the driver's seat. We've got to get out of here. McAllister scrambled into the cockpit, his face a mask of concentration. The engine sputtered and hummed, and for a moment, Bill feared it wouldn't start. But then with a loud roar, the M7 Priest came to life again. "Get the gun ready," Bill barked at Jacobs, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the Germans would be on them in minutes. They had to strike fast, or they would be overrun. The pressure was mounting, and Bill could feel it like a vice around his chest. The enemy artillery had found their range, and the M7 Priest was now the target. But they couldn't just sit there exposed. If they stayed put, they would be annihilated. "Fire when ready," Bill shouted, his voice shaking. His hands gripped the controls with all his might, every fiber of his being focused on the task at hand. The gun fired again, the blast echoing through the hills. This time, Bill didn't wait. He stood, watching through the smoke as the shell soared toward its target, praying it would hit. But the tension in the air was palpable. The Germans were closing in, and Bill could feel it in his gut. The next moments would determine everything. Would they survive? Would they clear the path for the infantry? Or would this be the end? In that split second, as the sound of the blast faded and the smoke began to clear, Bill knew that something crucial was about to happen. He couldn't explain it. He just felt it. The battlefield was alive, a ticking clock, and every second that passed felt like it could be their last. The blast from the 105mm Howitzer reverberated through Bill's chest. But this time there was no time to savor the echo of victory. The tension that had been building since the first shot now reached a fever pitch, as if the very air around them had been charged with the weight of impending disaster. The shell had left the barrel with the speed of death, but whether it had found its mark, Bill couldn't tell. The battlefield was engulfed in smoke and dust, the distant hills shrouded in an eerie haze. Bill's mind raced as the deafening roar of the artillery barrage continued. The Germans were not taking this lying down. They had been caught off guard initially, but now they were shifting into overdrive. The shells that had exploded around them were just the beginning. Bill's gut tightened as he heard the unmistakable sound of German artillery firing back, the thundering crash of enemy shells that seemed to come from all directions. "Move!" Bill shouted as the first shell landed just a few meters from the M7 Priest. The force of the explosion sent a shockwave through the ground, and Bill felt it deep in his bones. His body tensed, instinctively pushing him to act, to take cover, but there was no place to hide. Not now. Jacob, was still crouched beside the howitzer, shouted, "We're exposed, Bill. We need to get out of here." Bill's eyes flicked to the horizon. The German positions were still heavily entrenched, well positioned to send a counterattack at a moment's notice. His mind raced, trying to calculate the best move, but all he could see was the smoke and debris, blurring everything in his path. They had to make a decision. The path forward was clear. He could fire another round, but their position was vulnerable. The enemy was quick and organized. If they didn't move now, they would be sitting ducks, their artillery becoming their death sentence. "Get the gun loaded, Jacobs," Bill ordered, trying to keep his voice steady, though his heart raced in his chest. "McAllister, get us moving. We can't stay here." McAllister's hands were already on the wheel, his face a mask of concentration. Bill could feel the tension radiating off of him. He didn't need to say anything. McAllister knew the stakes just as well as he did. The engine roared to life, and the M7 Priest lurched forward, bouncing over the uneven ground, narrowly avoiding another round of German artillery. But Bill's thoughts were not on the M7 Priest's mobility or the immediate dangers of enemy fire. He was fixated on the mission. The target had been destroyed. He had seen the smoke and the flash of the explosion, but it wasn't enough. The Germans would retaliate. The infantry needed support, but Bill knew that another strike, another shot, was a gamble. If they stayed too long in one position, they would be caught in the open, exposed to the full wrath of the German artillery. Their lives and the lives of the infantry depending on them hung by a thread. A sharp whistle split the air as another round of shells from the German artillery rained down. Bill could see them now, the silhouettes of German soldiers moving in the distance, their positions taking shape as they prepared for the counterattack. Bill's mind snapped back to the task at hand. He had to make a choice. The decision before him was clear: stay and fire another shot or retreat, risking their lives in the process. It was a matter of priorities. His mind flashed to the faces of the infantry soldiers who were depending on them. They had to clear the way for the ground troops to advance. But staying too long would mean certain death. "Bill!" Jacob's voice broke through the din of the battlefield. His eyes were wide with panic. "We're going to get trapped here. We need to pull back." Bill clenched his jaw, the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. The choice was no longer about the mission. It was about survival. And survival meant retreating before they were annihilated. But as he glanced over at the infantry advancing toward the target area, the weight of what he was about to do hit him. If they retreated now, they might lose their chance to clear the path for the infantry. They would be stuck, vulnerable to a full German counterattack, and the cost would be the lives of those men who relied on their support. McAllister's voice cut through his thoughts. "Bill, we've got to go. Now!" Bill's heart was pounding in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to move, to pull back before they were surrounded. But something inside him rebelled against that urge. He had spent years training for this moment, honing the skills of his crew, preparing them for the chaos of battle. He couldn't let them down now. "Fire the next round!" Bill shouted, his voice filled with urgency. There was no room for doubt. "Get it ready! We'll make it count!" But as he shouted the orders, another explosion rocked the ground beneath them. This one was closer. The force of the blast sent Bill flying, his body slamming into the side of the M7 Priest. For a moment, everything went black, and all he could hear was the ringing in his ears. His chest ached from the impact, and he could taste the dust and blood in his mouth. When he opened his eyes, the world around him was a blur. Smoke filled the air, and the M7 Priest had been rocked violently by the explosion. He could barely make out Jacob's face, streaked with dirt and fear. McAllister was still in the driver's seat, his hands tightly gripping the controls, but his face was grim. Bill could see it in their eyes. They knew what this meant. "Bill!" Jacob shouted, his voice breaking through the haze. "We can't stay here. We're done!" Bill shook his head, his vision swimming. He could hear the German guns in the distance, reloading for another round, the ticking clock echoing in his mind. His crew was in danger, the infantry was exposed, and they couldn't afford another hit. The enemy was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they would be surrounded. Bill turned to Jacobs, his decision clear. "Get ready to move," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're pulling back. We'll fire one more shot and then get out of here." For a moment, there was a flicker of hope in Jacob's eyes. They had a plan, but Bill knew it wouldn't be enough. The decision had been made, but at what cost? The German forces would be relentless, and the path to retreat was becoming narrower by the second. As the M7 Priest rumbled forward, the tension in Bill's chest reached its peak. His heart raced, his body tense with anticipation, and his mind grappled with the gravity of what he had just done. The choice to pull back, to abandon the mission, would haunt him forever. But there was no turning back now, and as the M7 Priest began its retreat, the battle for survival had truly begun. The M7 Priest lurched forward, its wheels grinding over the uneven, war-torn terrain as it fought against the weight of its own momentum. Bill Carter's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse a drumbeat in the chaos of the battlefield. The decision had been made. They were pulling back. The mission to clear the way for the infantry, the promise to provide artillery support, had failed. But as the M7 Priest rolled into a retreat, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were running from something they couldn't outrun. The German artillery was fast, accurate, and relentless. Every second they spent out in the open, vulnerable, was a second closer to certain death. Yet the retreat itself was just as dangerous. The Germans had adapted quickly, shifting into counteroffensive mode, their soldiers springing into action as they fought to regain control of the battlefield. "Faster, McAllister!" Bill shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Get us out of here!" McAllister didn't need to be told twice. His hands gripped the wheel as the engine roared to life, pushing the M7 Priest forward with all its might. The ground shook as the German artillery rained down around them, the blast sending shock waves that rattled Bill's bones. He could hear the unmistakable whistle of incoming shells, their high-pitched scream cutting through the air like a knife. It was only a matter of time before one would find its mark. As they pushed forward, the M7 Priest swerved, dodging another blast. The force of the explosion rocked the vehicle, sending debris flying in all directions. Bill gritted his teeth, clenching his fists around the controls. They had to make it. They had to survive. But then came the worst sound Bill could have imagined. The sound of the engine sputtering, the power suddenly cutting out. The M7 Priest jolted, its forward momentum grinding to a halt. The air around them was thick with smoke, and the distant rumble of artillery was now almost deafening. "McAllister, what the hell happened?" Bill demanded, his voice tight with panic. The driver's face was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to restart the engine. I don't know, Bill. The engine's shot. We're stuck." In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The German artillery was closing in. The enemy had pinpointed their position, and there was no way they could escape. The M7 Priest, their lifeline, was now a sitting target. "We need to get out, now!" Jacob shouted from the back, his voice frantic. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to finish us off." Bill's mind raced. The crew was in danger, and the infantry was still depending on them, still counting on their support. But the M7 Priest was useless. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't retreat. Their only option was to fight. "Get out!" Bill shouted. "Grab your gear and move, now!" There was no time to waste. The crew scrambled to evacuate, each of them moving quickly, though the chaos of the battlefield slowed them down. Bill was the last to leave, his heart heavy as he glanced back at the M7 Priest. It had been their salvation, their weapon, their shield, but now it was a broken relic of a lost cause. They were on their own. The field around them was a nightmare. German artillery continued to pound the earth, sending massive shock waves through the air. The roar of the shells echoed like thunder, but it was the silence after each explosion that held the true terror. Each blast left them exposed, with the sound of incoming fire the only warning before it hit. "Move, Bill!" Jacob shouted, pulling Bill away from his thoughts. "We need to get to cover." Bill nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The infantry was still exposed. They had to do something. They had to help. But there was no way they could get back in the fight. The M7 Priest was immobilized, and they had no heavy artillery to back them up. The decision had been made, and they were powerless to change it. Then from out of the smoke, the German soldiers appeared. A group of enemy infantry was advancing, moving with terrifying precision, their rifles raised as they crept closer. Bill's blood ran cold. They were close now, too close. His crew scattered, diving into the nearest ditch for cover. But Bill didn't move. He couldn't. Something inside him refused to run. He had come this far, and now when the Germans were on the brink of overwhelming them, he was going to turn tail. Not on his watch. "Bill!" Jacobs yelled from the ditch. "Get down!" But Bill was already moving, his feet carrying him through the smoke and debris, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He didn't know what he was doing. It was instinct now, the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless firefights. He wasn't about to let this end with them retreating into nothing. He would make a stand. With a grim determination, Bill grabbed a discarded rifle from the ground and rushed toward the advancing German soldiers. The enemy hadn't seen him yet. He could hear their boots crunching through the dirt, their voices muffled by the chaos around them. His heart was racing in his chest, and his hands were shaking as he steadied the rifle. He could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of his decision. This was it. This was his last chance to do something, anything to turn the tide. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the battlefield. The German soldier closest to him fell, the shot hitting its mark with a sickening thud. Bill's heart raced. The rush of combat, the thrill of survival, surged through him. But it was fleeting. The Germans were closing in. Another explosion ripped through the ground, and Bill was thrown to the ground. He hit the earth with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. For a moment, everything went black. When Bill came to, he could barely breathe. His body ached, and he struggled to push himself up from the dirt. The battle raged around him, but everything felt distant, as though he were submerged in water. He could see Jacobs and McAllister, both of them huddled behind a fallen tree, waiting for the next move. But Bill knew that it was too late. They were too far out in the open. "Go," Bill whispered to himself, his voice ragged. "Go now. Live. Fight for them." And then, as the German infantry closed in, Bill made the decision that would define his legacy. He ran. It was a desperate sprint, a sacrifice. He threw himself into the open, drawing the enemy's fire away from his crew. They had their chance to escape, but it was now or never. Bill knew what he was doing, and he didn't hesitate. His legs burned as he sprinted, the sound of rifle fire tearing through the air. And then, a sharp pain in his chest. A bullet. He staggered, his vision blurring. His body fell to the ground, but he didn't feel the impact. His last thoughts were of the crew, of the infantry, of the men he had served with. Bill Carter had made his choice. He had given them the chance to live. As darkness took over, he felt the weight of the world slip away, replaced by the quiet, inevitable peace of knowing he had done everything he could. The battlefield was quiet now, a strange and eerie silence settling over the wreckage of war. Bill Carter lay motionless in the dirt, his body battered and broken, but the world around him was still. The German artillery had moved on, their infantry retreating, leaving behind only the marks of destruction. The once vibrant fields of St. Marie, now reduced to craters and smoke, had witnessed too many deaths, too many sacrifices. But as the silence lingered, a new sound began to emerge, the soft, steady footsteps of soldiers. It wasn't the marching of enemy troops, but the careful approach of the American infantry, now advancing cautiously through the smoke. They had made it. They had survived. Bill's sacrifice, his final desperate act, had given them the time they needed to break through, to push forward. As the first soldiers reached the M7 Priest, now abandoned and gutted by the explosions, their eyes scanned the wreckage. They found the bodies of Bill's crew scattered nearby, Jacobs, McAllister, and the others. Their expressions were grim as they carefully examined the scene. The soldiers had seen too much death to be moved by it in the usual way. They had learned to bury their emotions, to carry on with their duty. But Bill's actions, his sacrifice, were not something they could forget. A young soldier, barely out of his teens, bent down beside Bill's body. His hand hovered over the sergeant's lifeless form, as though unsure how to react. He didn't know Bill, didn't have the chance to see the man's face in anything other than his uniform. But something about his sacrifice, about the desperation and courage in that final moment, resonated deeply within him. "Bill Carter," the soldier whispered, his voice barely audible, the words lost in the wind. "You gave everything." The rest of the crew gathered around, their faces stoic but haunted by the loss. There was no ceremony, no pomp, just the grim acknowledgement of what had happened. The war had a way of stripping everything away, leaving only the raw truth of human sacrifice. They would move on, because they had no choice. But Bill's memory would live on in the quiet moments between battles, in the heavy silence of those who knew the true cost of war. Back at headquarters, Major Thompson had received the news. He had known Bill personally, respected him, and had trusted him with the safety of his men. The loss hit him harder than he expected. For the rest of the campaign, every time the infantry pushed forward, every time the artillery roared in the distance, Major Thompson would think of Bill. He would think of the soldier who had given his life so others could live, and he would carry that weight in his heart. But it wasn't just the soldiers on the battlefield who were affected by Bill's sacrifice. The people back home, those who had heard the stories of the war from their sons, husbands, and fathers, would feel the reverberations of his actions as well. His family, if they knew the truth of how he had died, would find solace in the fact that he had fought with honor, that he had made a difference, even if it was in the final, desperate moments of his life. War had a way of marking its participants, of leaving scars both physical and psychological. The men who survived the Battle of St. Marie would carry the weight of Bill's death with them for the rest of their lives. Some would cope with it by telling stories, by drinking themselves to sleep, or by burying their memories deep in the recesses of their minds. Others would live with the guilt of having lived when Bill hadn't. But the lesson would always remain. War was not about glory. It was not about winning or losing. It was about survival. And sometimes survival meant sacrifice. As the battle moved on, the Allies advanced through France, pushing back the German forces. The victory at St. Marie, though hard won, would eventually contribute to the larger effort to liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. But for those who had been on the ground, who had fought and bled in the trenches, The price of that victory would forever be measured in the lives of those who had given everything. Bill's sacrifice, the moment of selflessness in the face of certain death, became a quiet symbol for those who knew the true cost of freedom. In the days and weeks that followed, his name would be spoken with reverence among the soldiers of the 7th Armored Division. It was a name that would be carried by the wind, whispered by those who had witnessed his final act of courage. They would remember him, not for his rank, his skills, or his status, but for the man he had been, the soldier who had placed his comrades' survival above his own. The letter arrived at home a few weeks later, sent by the Army's official channels. It was brief, as most letters of this kind were, but it carried a weight that no words could ever fully convey. We regret to inform you that Sergeant William Carter of the 7th Armored Division was killed in action during the recent push toward Sainte Marie, France. His courage, leadership, and selflessness on the battlefield were an inspiration to those who served with him. He is survived by his comrades who will carry his memory forward. For Bill's family, the letter was a mixture of grief and pride. They had lost a son, a brother, a husband, but in the silence of their mourning, they knew he had given everything for a cause larger than himself. The people he had saved, the lives he had touched, were all that mattered now. The world would move on, as it always did, but in the small towns and quiet streets of home, the memory of Sergeant William Carter would endure.